the endocrine system. All right, we're going to talk about hemoconcentration and hemodilution. Now, we've already talked a little bit about hemoconcentration, but we're going to just kind of go over it again just to kind of reinforce it. So here are the two outcomes for today. So hemoconcentration, as we talked about at the end of the last lecture, when we sweat or when we exercise, we increase our sweat rate. This is great because it keeps us cooled down. The problem is, or potential problem, is that we have a lower or reduced plasma volume. Okay, while sweat does contain sodium or salt, we don't lose a whole lot of salt that way. And so as a result, due to the decreased plasma volume, we have an increased plasma sodium concentration. And so we call this hemoconcentration. All right. Now, to counteract this, we release ADH or vasopressin from the posterior pituitary. There are actually sensors that are called osmoreceptors. They're a type of chemoreceptor that sense the concentration of sodium. And so when we have high sodium, they stimulate the release of vasopressin. And so as a result, this is going to help prevent or at least try and reduce the risk of severe dehydration, because we're going to release this vasopressin, so we're going to hold on to as much available water as possible. All right, so when we go exercise, one of the things that happens is that proteins are able to leave, or some proteins are able to leave muscle cells, okay? And the proteins enter plasma. Well, one of the things that proteins do is that they attract water just like salt does. And so, excuse me, if I've got high concentrations or high levels of protein in my plasma, I'm going to increase the amount of fluid in my plasma. So I'm going to have an increased plasma volume. And so this, along with the vasopressin that's been released by my, as a result of my sweating, is going to lead to something called hemodilution. All right. So we've got a lot of fluid floating around. And so this can cause some issues as well. So with hemodilution, though, we're not really talking about salt. We're talking about red blood cells. So the first thing we need to make sure that you understand is hematocrit. So hematocrit is just what percentage of your blood is made up of actual red blood cells. This ranges from about 40 to 45 in women, 45 to 50, maybe a little bit higher in men. Okay. And so those are typical values. Well, with hemodilution, what happens is we've got a reduced hematocrit due to increased plasma volume. Okay, we're not changing the number of red blood cells that are floating around in your body. What we're changing is the amount of fluid that those red blood cells are floating in. So why does this matter? Well, the effect is that if I've got fewer blood cells per volume of blood, that means I can deliver less oxygen. Okay. Now, depending on what I'm doing and the intensity of the activity, it might not be that big of a deal. I can just increase cardiac output to make up the effects of hemodilution, right? So let's just say that somehow I decrease my hematocrit by 10%. Well, then all I have to do is just increase my stroke volume by 10%. So at low activity levels, that's not a big deal. But when we're getting up into intense exercise, high intensity exercise, that can be problematic. And so we need to counteract this. The problem is this takes time. Okay. And so we're going to use vasopressin and aldosterone to offset these changes. So we'll get rid of sodium, we'll get rid of water if that's the case, and eventually hematocrit will go back to normal. All right. So this is great in the long term, but in the short term, it can be a little difficult. And so we, when we're exercising, we want to kind of counteract that hemodilution. And so we'll talk more about that in class as well. And I want you to think about, well, how can we counteract this during exercise? So last set of questions for the endocrine system here. So can you describe the relationship between plasma volume and hematocrit and explain how these two processes or conditions occur?